Apologies for the delay. Systems weren't connecting properly over here. So I also found out actually that the only way you can find where the room is that you have to install some app. And I didn't have it installed, so it took quite a while to find someone with a printed agenda that could tell me where I should come. But I'm here now, and we've only lost 3 minutes, so it's all good. How many of you here know Kotlin? Right? So this is not a talk about me introducing you to Kotlin, but Kotlin is very simple. It's kind of like any other language that you've seen, essentially, whether you do Java, C#, JavaScript, PHP. Well, no, it's got nothing to do with PHP, but the other one's more or less the same. And I'm going to introduce you to Ktor, which is a library that we've been working on. If you go to a website on Ktor, it's called the Synchronous Framework for Connected Systems. I find that this is not really enticing enough for people to try it out, so I've come up with my own subtitle, which is a synchronous framework for distributed microservices backed with blockchain. Because if you throw microservices and blockchain into anything, people just like it, so it works fine. And the best part about it is that you can create microservices here and blockchain. Well, nowadays everything is blockchain, so how does it matter anymore? But anyway, what is Ktor? Ktor is a server, it's a client, it's a multi-platform server and client, and it's Kotlin through and through, which means it's basically built from the ground up using Kotlin. It's also asynchronous in nature. Ktor is also open source, which for us it basically means it's free. It's built and maintained primarily by JetBrains. That's us, the ones that make Kotlin. And it's inspired by other frameworks such as Wasabi and Kara. Did anybody use any of these ever? No, not a single hand go up. Oh, well. I wrote Wasabi. Thank you. Thank you for the support there. At least it was inspired by Wasabi. I can claim, that's my claim to fame. I inspired some other framework. Ktor can be used for creating client-side, server-side applications. You can use HTTP APIs. And just to be clear, HTTP API is not the same as REST. Right? I know there's a whole religious group out there that feel that REST and HTTP APIs are the same thing. They're not. But the great thing is that you can also create RESTful systems if you want as well, which is basically a bunch of constraints. You can work with sockets, and you can have client-side connections and client-side libraries also. What are Ktor's goals? Ktor's goals are to be simple, to be flexible, performant, and cross-platform. Now, every time I read out this slide, it's funny, because I'm like, would I ever put a slide together that says Ktor's goals are to be complex, rigid, really bad at performance, and on a single platform? No, but this slide looks so good, right? And in fact, we try and follow this, these whatever you want to call them, pillars of Ktor. So let me show you a very simple server for Ktor. Now, how many of you here actually do web development? Right. And use something like Spring or Spring Boot? Okay. So the great thing is that I'm asking you questions and I don't see anyone because of the fog lights, but it's okay. I'm just assuming you're putting up your hands. So I'll just, I'll reassure myself that yes, there's a whole bunch of you that do that. If you take a look at your minimum server here, I have a function, and then I have a server, which is the embedded server, and the transport, so to speak, not the transport, but the thing that is running on is kind of called Netty. If you're familiar with Netty, it's basically a lower-level application library that allows you to run a whole bunch of different types of communication things on it. Then it's got this thing called the routing, which we'll dive into, where in this case, I'm saying basically that I have a get on the home path, and then I respond with text. Now, if you're astute and you're paying attention, you realize that that is actually wrong. There's a bug in there, because I'm saying that the return type is content type text HTML, and in fact, I'm not returning HTML. I'm returning plain text. But it's great that all the browsers nowadays don't really care. So if you return HTML or plain text, it just works anyway. So thank you to the browsers. And then what you do is basically just define the route, and you start up the server, and away you go. Okay? And that is the simplest thing that you can do in Ktor to create the essential of what would be a hello world, right, as an HTTP API endpoint. Now, Ktor in itself is basically built up of the concept of modules. So when I have a Ktor application, I can have multiple modules. And those multiple modules in and each of themselves can represent different areas of an application. So if you're familiar with something like Spring, you might have heard of the concept of a customer controller or an invoice controller. This isn't mapping to that. A module can be a single controller, it can be multiple controllers. It's just a way to logically divide up your applications. We did this so that a single host, a single Ktor host can serve multiple modules. The reality is that oftentimes that doesn't really happen. People just have single modules. But we'll see how the modules actually work today. The way that it basically works inside each module is that I basically make a request, and then it goes through a pipeline, which is called the routing, and then I have my app logic, which could be connecting to databases or serving customers or whatever you want, and then I have the response. Now, in between these things, I have what in Ktor we call features, which you may be familiar with other technologies, such as middleware. If you've heard of middleware, if you've come from Node.js or Express.js, you may have heard of middleware. If you've come from ASP.NET, MVC, you might have heard of interceptors. They're basically things that allow you to intercept a request and provide certain types of functionality. In Ktor, those are called features. And then there's different types of features. There's, for example, encoding, where I can encode something. There is compression, where I can compress something. But even more so, in Ktor, everything is basically built as a feature. So the routing itself is also a feature. So essentially, I have this abstraction over the type of call, which could be socket or it could be HTTP, and then I can insert these features anywhere I want. And different to many of the existing frameworks where normally they can say to you that you can insert an interceptor or middleware in specific locations, with Ktor you can essentially insert them anywhere and define the order of one feature over another. So that's it, what I've got with slides. Well, I've got a few more, but now let's switch over to code and I'll show you something, some stuff with code. Okay, hopefully you can see that, right? You can see that? Oh, wow, you can see that. That's beautiful. Okay, so here's your most simple application. Now, one thing, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that I don't have that netty embedded whatever. I basically have an application called simple, and inside it I have a routing, which is get, and the response text. In this case, it doesn't have the bug. Now, why don't I have that embedded netty server that I'm launching? Because in real-world applications, kind of applications that you would build and ship, you don't really want to have the transports or the mechanism on which it rests as part of the code. You can kind of abstract that, and you can make a lot of the things in terms of configuration external to the application. So what you could do is define what's called an application config file, which defines the actual port. So it would either go for port 8080 or the first random port available, and then it loads a bunch of modules. Now, in principle, I could load all of these modules. But here, I'm actually going to load one by one to show you the different examples, right? But this is where I was saying that you can have multiple modules. In this case, my application is only going to load the simple module. And where is the application? That code remains the same throughout all of the demos. It's essentially the main function that, in this case, is running the netty engine and passing in the arguments. And the arguments can be passed in the command line. If there's nothing found in the command line, then it would read that configuration file that I told you. Now, normally when you start a Ktor application, this isn't how you would do it. You could create go to Chrome, and then go to start.spring, no, not spring, start.ktor.io. That was on purpose. And I don't know what inspired this, but we have something similar to whatever inspired this. So you can have your like Gradle with DSL project, Maven project. You have all of your different servers and your clients, and then you can build or install the IntelliJ plugin. And if you install the IntelliJ plugin, then you can say new project, and then click here Ktor, and you essentially have the same thing. So you can start your project in this way as well. Okay? So now that I've got my project, all I have to do is run it, and basically what that's going to do, you see how quick that was? That's one of the things that people like. Last time I gave this talk, someone's like, what are you doing to make it launch so fast? I'm like, that's just Ktor. Like, it is already launched. It's here. As soon as I ran it, it's basically launched, right? And I can launch, open the browser, and you can see that I have my hello world. Okay? And that's as simple as it gets. So if I want to change the application, now let's go and see the next example, which in this case is going to be static. So Ktor allows you to obviously respond to routes, but it also allows you to load static content. So if we go to the static, we can see that essentially all you need to do is, again, define a routing and then say, use this function that's called static. And static basically sets a URL and says anything that's under this URL is going to be statically loaded. So I can serve any file as I want. And here you can see that I have the resources mapped to a folder called static where I have the Ktor logo. So if I were to run this, and notice the only thing I changed was actually loading that, changing the module in the configuration file. And now I could do something like static and then Ktor, and I have the logo. Okay, so you can have static files, you can serve routes, etc., all very simply built in. And all of these are basically functions. For those of you that are not familiar with Kotlin, these are all essentially higher order functions, right? So I have a function here which is called routing, which takes another function, and that in a sense takes another function which is called static, which has two arguments. First of all is a string, and the second one is another function, and so on and so forth. So if you navigate to static, you see that that's essentially a function. Right? This is one of the features of Kotlin. Again, if you're not familiar, that you can create nice little DSLs with that. So we can do that with Ktor as well. So let's continue down the path of demos, and let's go ahead and load something like HTML. Now, HTML allows us to combine two features that we've created. One of them is the HTMLX library, which is essentially a standalone library in Kotlin, which allows you to create HTML in a statically typed way. So you know how you normally write HTML, right? Now you have it in a statically typed way. And here you can combine that with code, with Kotlin code. So in essence, I'm doing HTML DSL, and I'm going and printing out a header one, and then I'm looping with some Kotlin code and printing out a bunch of elements. Now, a lot of people see this and they're like, ooh, this is horrible. This is kind of like, where did my separation of concerns go? I don't know. The same place they went with React, right? It's like people are using JSX all day and they're like, oh, I won't mix HTML with that. But JSX, no. And by the way, it's not about separation of concerns. Is more about other things, not the actual language that you use. They cheated on us, you know. Back in the old days, this is how we used to create websites. We used to have these things called, now I'm sounding like an old man, but well, I am. But we had like these CGIs and ISAPIs, and we used to like render data from the database and push it server side. Then came the single page applications, and then people said, oh, this isn't really performance. And then people were like having a ball when Twitter said, we're now going to render everything server side. We're like, okay. Server side, how come we didn't think of that? Anyway, so this basically all it does is just render that HTML. So if I run it, in this case, I'm saying respond with static HTML DSL. So it would come here and say HTML DSL, and then it would print out my HTML DSL. And you see, there's no jQuery in there or anything else, or Bootstrap. It's like you can't do anything nowadays without Bootstrap. You can tell I'm frustrated with web development, can't you? I used to like it. My bio used to say he loves web development. I'm like, no, those days are gone. So I've shown you two examples that basically renders HTML, and then most of them are with get. But now let's do some things that are a little bit more quote unquote complicated. So in this case, what I have is essentially a routing which renders two things. If I do a get, it's going to render a form, and then if I do a post, it's going to actually submit that form. So in this case, you can see that basically in the get, all I'm doing is, again, using respond HTML to define my head, to define my form action. Notice here a string, and we'll come back to this later on. And here I've got that same string form, and then I'm basically just saying, well, for each multi-part, because it's a multi-part form, so basically allows you to upload fields and files. So Ktor has this concept of multi-part, and from there I do for each part, and then get access to the part's value, which in this case is going to cast it to a field, a text input. In this case, it's going to smart cast it to an input file, etc. And notice throughout all of this, what I'm doing is I'm not using HTTP or request or response directly, or everything is coming off this object call. And this object call is essentially an abstraction because Ktor allows you for sockets, it allows you to it allows for HTTP, it can allow for any protocol. So it's abstracting that in this concept called call, where then you can have the request and the response. So let's run this one, which I think that I configured properly. So if we just run it, now if we open this up, I should get the form. I was too fast. No. What did I do wrong? Get. Oh, there you go. So testing, and then I could say, for example, choose a file, and then we'll go, for example, here and send, and you can see that I get my form field and I get my PDF, the content type of the PDF, etc. So it's got built-in support also for multi-part forms. You can do all of those things as well. What else do we have? Now let's get to the features. So far we've seen get, post, etc. But applications are a little bit more complicated. What if I want to make use of some things, like, for example, as simple as JSON serialization? Or even before JSON serialization, let's take a look at default headers. Now, remember I told you that Ktor has a bunch of things which are called features. And these features, the routing, you've seen that actually, I said it's a feature, but it's not kind of defined. And yet here, I'm defining a feature. How do I define a feature? I say install and the name of the feature. So when in my application startup, if I want to use a feature, I would do install feature. So in this case, I'm installing the default headers. The routing, I'm not. But that's because the routing is I'm using a helper function which in itself will do the installing of the routing. So it is also a feature, right? It's just that usually in the routing, I would use routing instead of doing install feature and then adding a bunch of routes. So in this case, what I'm going to do is install default headers. So when you make a normal request with Ktor, you're not going to get any headers. If you want specific headers, such as the default ones, you would have to install the default headers. So out of the box, when you start a new Ktor application, there's about 5 or 6 normal features that you're going to always be installing, right? So if we were to run this one, we would basically be able to access the headers. So if I open up the form and then do in network, then we'll do localhost 000 8080 headers. You can see that I get my headers. Okay? So except encoding, some of these headers wouldn't even be present if I wouldn't do install headers. So that's something that normally you would use when you're creating a Ktor application. But let's now take a look at JSON. So usually when I create some applications, I want to just send back some JSON with my code. And here, I'm doing that exactly. Okay? So I've got some routing get customer, and then I'm doing val model customer. And this is a normal data class. This is nothing more than a normal data class. So here I would have customer, the ID, the name, and the email. Okay? And then I am just doing call respond model. So no need to do any kind of serialization, no need to convert it into JSON, nothing. I'm doing that, it's doing that for me automatically. Now, how does it do that? Well, I'm installing the feature which is called content negotiation. Now, how many of you are familiar with content negotiation? Okay. So content negotiation isn't just about sending back JSON. Content negotiation is essentially a mechanism by which the client and the servers are negotiating some things. Normally, that negotiation takes place using the accept header. So when a request comes in, the client sends a request header and the different types of formats that it supports. And one of these parameters is the queue or the weight. And one is the default weight, and that indicates the priority of the content type it wants to receive. So in this case, it's saying I'll accept text HTML, application XML, etc., and the order in which I will accept that. So when Ktor receives that request, it will see the accept headers come in. It will see the types of headers that can be sent back. And if it can, it will serialize in that header. If it can't, it will say content type not supported, which is an HTTP status code. So this is not only about serialization, but also about content negotiation. But notice that this install also has a block of code. And this block of code is what we call the setup or the configuration for the feature. A lot of features actually come with configuration steps. So in this case, what I'm saying is that I want to use JSON, the library JSON, to do the actual serialization for me. And JSON, in turn, has its own configuration parameters, right? So I get all of this pretty code completion, right? Set date format, all of this, I get it because this is actually supporting JSON. If I were to use something like Jackson, then I would get the configuration parameters for Jackson. And these are already built in. These are features that you can already use. So in this case, I'm configuring not only that I want content negotiation, but I also am indicating how I want that to be done by the library that I'm using. And we support JSON, I think Jackson, and Kotlin serialization, which would be very strange if we wouldn't support it. Right? So running this, you can guess what's going to happen. I just get back my wonderful JSON. So run this, and then do JSON. So I say, oh, sorry, customer. And I get back my wonderful JSON with no effort whatsoever. Okay. Now, again, a lot of frameworks already have this. This is something you've come to expect, which is fantastic, but it's also something that you now know that is supported out of the box with Ktor. Authentication, we have support for OAuth, we have support for basic authentication. I won't run this, but I'll explain to you the way that you essentially work with authentication. Here, again, I'm going back to installing a feature. So in this case, I'm also saying install authentication, and then inside this, I have different mechanisms of authentication. I can have OAuth, I can have basic. In this case, I have basic, and inside basic, I have one that I called auth. But I could have multiple ones here if I wanted to. Like I have basic second auth as well, right? Based on the different realms. And then here I said I define the realm of the basic authentication. I use a very, very complicated algorithm to determine if the credentials are valid. You have the ability to set the ID of a principal. The concept of principal also exists in Ktor. So essentially, in this case, what I'm saying is I'm setting the principal of the username, and then that persists throughout the actual entire session so that I could always reference that. And here I'm defining setting up my authentication. Now, how do I use this? So in this case, I have two routings. I have one which is just the root path, and I have another one which is called authenticate. And this one is the one that is authenticated. So anything that goes to root doesn't require authentication. Anything that comes under the function authenticate requires authentication. So in this case, it would prompt for the basic authentication. So this means that you can define your different types of authentications and use them in different parts of the roots by basically encapsulating them in the corresponding functions. Now, how do I actually extend Ktor? Because, as I said, it comes with a whole bunch of features. Like if you want serialization, compression, I think that, well, multi-part we've already seen. We've seen chunking, you know, where you send chunks of back in the request. There's a ton of things that are available already in Ktor. In fact, the other day I just learned, how many of you use IOC frameworks? Very few. Do you use Dagger? No? The other day I saw a session that said if you use an IOC framework, you should use Dagger. It was by Google. Anyway, so I found out the other day that coin, which is spelled with a K, very original, does also support, also has a feature for Ktor, so you could directly support IOC containers such as coin in your application. But what if I want to create my own kind of feature? It's very, very simple. So here's a feature that I've created, which is custom header, which essentially what it does is set a custom header that's going to come back in every request. The header name is ABC, the value is def. That's it, DEF. Okay? And I install it just like I would, and then I have this part, which is the actual configuration parameter of my feature. So how do I go about implementing that? Well, you follow a very, very simple pattern. You declare a class. In that class, you pass as the parameter, the configuration. So that's going to be all of the things in the feature that you want to be able to configure, which is going to be a nested class configuration. So in this case, I have two features, two properties. I have name and value, which we saw before. And then you have a companion object feature that implements application pipeline call, right? This is basically that call object. And in there, you have a function which is install, and inside there, then you actually execute the work that's going to be done. So you have one part of the feature, which is the configuration, which are all the parameters that you want to set, and then you have another part, which is the actual execution, what you want to happen in that feature. So in this case, all I'm doing is every time that feature is going to be called, I'm going to respond with response.header and send that back. So if I were to run this, you could see that I get back my custom feature. Let's go back here, and the request is get. So you see in my network, you can see that I have my ABC, DEF. Okay? As simple as that. Like, there's no magic to creating features, and it's not very complicated. It's simply essentially implementing a single class, and you can just implement the intercept method and the install and do your work there. Okay. Now, I've shown you very, very simple examples. And we can go a little bit more complicated here. For example, let's take a look at the routing one. For instance, here, you can see that now I start to have multiple routes, and I have my get, etc. But notice here, instead of doing get post, I have another route. And in this route, what I'm doing is basically nested routes. So Ktor allows you to define essentially routes at the top level or start to nest your routes. So in this case, I have nested routes customer, and inside there I have get and I have post. I have an employee, and then I have a get ID. What is that? That is the route parameter. So if you want route parameters like customer/1, you would use the curly braces, the name of the parameter, and curly braces. And then you access that with parameters.id. And you're starting to say, okay, this is a little bit ugly because that's a lot of strings in there. And I don't really like strings. Well, I mean, they're fine. I mean, and if you refactor like with IntelliJ or something, it'll probably pick those up. But there is a better way to do this, which we'll see in a second. But the other thing that you need to realize is that this starts to become a little bit ugly, right? Because I'm not going to have my entire application in one function, right? How do I structure my application? If you use a framework such as Spring, it's very simple. Spring says to you, you want something that responds to customer? Yes, create a class called customer controller. You want something that responds to invoices? Yes, create a class called invoice controller. And it's very straightforward. With Ktor, we give you the flexibility of you do whatever the hell you want, which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But if you want to declare things in a single function, go ahead. We don't recommend it. But if you want to separate out your functions into multiple ones, yes. If you want to put them in multiple files, yes. If you want to put them in classes, yes. You can do whatever you want with Ktor. If you have a need to have your functions in classes for whatever reason, maybe you want to use an IOC framework that you have to inject dependencies, you can create a class called customer controller even, and then just define your routes there. Because ultimately, a route is nothing more than a function. And all you do is basically call that function. So one way that, for example, we create Ktor applications is we use this idea that we basically have kind of like root. We create extensions to root class, and then that way we don't have to call routing. We basically have access to the different roots. We have access to the different verbs, get, post, etc. So you can encapsulate these all in one function or in multiple functions. So for instance, you could have a file called home roots and then have different roots for all your different paths. Okay? How you structure your application is entirely up to you. But obviously do it in a way that is maintainable. Don't put everything in a single file. So here, for instance, I have put everything in a single file. Don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do, right? Okay. Now, let's go back to that string thing. And if you remember in the post, I said there's a form here and there's a form here. And if we go to the root, remember I said that this ID over here and this ID over here. That's kind of ugly. Can we do something better? That's where locations come in. Now, locations are something that's experimental still, which is why it's called experimental. And I personally hope that eventually they'll change the name because location is kind of confusing. How many of you are familiar with location header in HTTP? So location header is something really, really useful. If you ever have, if you're familiar with HTTP and you send a post is meant to create a new resource, right? So often the question comes up of, okay, if it's a new resource, how do I get back the URL of that resource? And oftentimes you see developers basically respond with an ID or an object, like send back JSON with the URL. There's actually a header in HTTP which is specifically for that, and it's called location. So if you look at the RFC for HTTP, location sends back the header, the URL of the newly created resource. This location has nothing to do with that location, which is why I hope that they rename it, because it's a little bit confusing. But this location, basically what it does is try and do strong typing for roots and for parameters. So it uses this concept of annotation of location, class, lowercase, because this isn't a real class, and defining the name of the root. So in this case, I have an index root and I have an employee root, and the employee root has a single parameter, which is ID. And then here I do install, but instead of doing get in brackets string, I do get index. And instead of doing parameters square brackets ID, I just do employee ID, which is the actual root. So this is essentially locations allows you to do strong typing with Ktor. Okay? Something that I would recommend you use, even though at some point, even when it's not experimental, we'll rename it, but it will still work for you. Right. Ktor is built from the ground up to be asynchronous. And that means that generally we try and avoid any kind of blocking. It uses coroutines. But what happens if you have a long-running process? Like, for instance, here I have this routing, and I do a get, and this is like a very long calculation. How can I make sure that Ktor never crashes and it never blocks threads or new requests from coming in? Essentially, all you need to do is use a suspend function. So if I use a suspend function and then do my heavy lifting in the context of the coroutine, I can rest assured that essentially I'm not going to run into any blocking of new requests coming in. And given that this is coroutines, I don't have any issues with synchronizing with the main thread. You can see here that, for example, the number that I'm incrementing in the coroutine, I can access directly in my response. Okay? So it's very simple to basically create non-blocking asynchronous applications. And it scales quite well. I mean, we at JetBrains, we've been working on a product which is server-side that we haven't announced yet, and it's been using Ktor through and through, and it scales quite well. And on top of that, it also uses the sockets of Ktor too. And last but not least, when it comes to testing, one good thing is that since it's completely decoupled, you don't actually have to spin anything up if you want to do a test. You essentially, in your application test, you say with test application, which is a function that comes with Ktor, you pass in a parameter testing true, and you just run your test. None of the pipeline, nothing has to be set up, and yet all of the functionality is there. Now, you can, of course, run your integration test, and it's recommended, but when you're trying to just test root parameters, make sure your routing is fine, all of those things, you don't need to worry about that. Okay? So, going back to the slides. Deployment options. You can run on Jetty, Tomcat, Netty, and CIO. Does anyone know what CIO is? I'll give you a clue. IO stands for input-output. C stands for coroutines. Yeah, okay, never mind. You know what that star means? It means don't use it yet, because it's slow. Why are we doing this? Well, because one of the things behind Ktor is that it's multi-platform. And we want to make sure that it really is multi-platform. Containers, Tomcat, because Netty, for example, isn't multi-platform. Containers, Tomcat, Jetty supports Java 6 through Java 11. I haven't updated the slides. I don't know, what are we on now? Java 17. So it supports Java 17 as well. Google App Engine, Heroku, Docker containers, Kubernetes, yes, because why not? It supports that too, and blockchain. If you want more information, go to ktor.io. If you want to start a new application, go to start.ktor.io. Thank you very much.